The dust from King Uzziah's tomb had barely settled in the year 740 before Christ, when the prophet Isaiah entered the temple and saw what no mortal should witness. The veil between heaven and earth grew thin that day, thin enough for a man to glimpse the throne room of God. And yet the scrolls do not tell you what Isaiah saw in the moments before the seraph touched his lips with fire. They do not tell you that one of those burning ones was already falling. The Hebrew word Seraphim means the burning ones, and they are described as six-winged beings who stand immediately before God's throne, covering their faces and their feet in reverence. Their whole existence is centered on magnifying the holiness of the Lord of hosts, crying out, "Holy, holy, holy," without ceasing. But the scrolls also record something strange in the margins of the ancient texts, something the councils chose not to canonize. There is a gap in the narrative, a silence where a name should be, and that silence has a cost. Here is what changes everything. The scriptures mention the seraphim only briefly, with no detailed explanation beyond the 6th chapter of Isaiah. One may reasonably surmise that they represent an order of created beings facilitating the will of deity. But what happens when one of those beings chooses to facilitate something else? What happens when a burning one looks down from the throne and sees a mortal soul worth more than the fire that defines him? The official story is simple enough. A single seraph touches Isaiah's lips with a burning coal taken from the altar, atoning for his sin and preparing him for prophetic speech. The coal comes from the altar, and the altar stands in the heavenly temple, and the seraph is merely a servant of that altar. But the official story leaves out a detail that the oldest manuscripts whisper about. The coal was not taken from the main altar. It was taken from a smaller altar, one that the seraph had built himself, one that he had kept hidden behind the folds of his wings for centuries. You have never heard this part because the compilers of the biblical canon did not include every fragment that survived the centuries. The Nag Hammadi library preserves texts that speak of angels who kept private altars, who made personal offerings that were not commanded by God. And one of those seraphim, the one whose name the later scribes erased from the margins of Isaiah, had been building such an altar for 400 years. Every time a mortal prayed with a sincerity that moved heaven, this seraph collected the residue of that prayer and added it to his own fire. He was not stealing, he was saving. This is the part most people miss. The seraph was not rebelling against heaven. He was preparing for something he knew he would one day need. He was storing up holiness, purifying his own flame, because he had seen a vision of a woman born in the line of David, a woman whose soul would be sought by the adversary before she drew her first breath. And he knew that to save her, he would have to trade something he could never recover. The prophet Isaiah had no way of knowing that the burning one bending toward him with the coal was weeping. The text does not record tears, because the text does not record what angels feel when they break covenant. But the seraph's wings trembled as he brought the coal to Isaiah's lips, because that coal was not an ordinary piece of altar fire. That coal was the first seed of the sacrifice he was about to make. He was giving away a piece of his own purification, a piece of the altar he had built in secret, to prepare a human mouth for a message that would ultimately lead to the exile of an entire nation. Isaiah received the fire and spoke. The nation did not listen, and the seraph watched from the threshold of heaven as the woman he had seen in vision was born, grew, and faced the moment for which he had been preparing. Her name was Abital, and she was 17 years old when the demon came from her contract. The demon did not want her body. He wanted her soul, specifically the part of her soul that connected her to the covenant line of David. The adversary had been collecting the souls of David's descendants for generations, gathering them like tribute, using them to build a throne in the abyss that mirrored the throne of heaven. Abital was the last one. If he took her, the line would break, and the prophecy of the coming Messiah would collapse like a temple with a cracked foundation. And yet, here is the question the scrolls do not answer. Can a seraph's sacrifice redeem a soul that does not even know it is being fought for? Abital, at 17, has no idea that a burning one has been storing fire for 4 centuries just to touch her life. If this story stirs something in you, if you feel the weight of what is being traded here, then subscribe and stay with us, because what comes next will peel back the very fabric of what covenant costs. And in the comments, leave one word: Abital. Let me see how many of you are tracking the lineage of her soul. The Seraph had seen this moment from the day he first began building his secret altar. He had 400 years of stored holiness, 400 years of prayer residue, 400 years of fire that belonged to him alone. And he made the trade. He descended from the throne room, folded his 6 wings into the shape of a mortal man, and walked into the demon's chamber with an offer that even the adversary did not expect. Here is the truth. The scrolls do not tell you. The Seraph did not trade his wings for her soul. He traded something far more precious. He traded the fire of his private altar, the very essence of his 400-year purification, for the contract that held Abital's soul. And when the demon accepted the trade, the Seraph's wings did not fall off. They grew cold. The burning ones burn because they stand before God's presence. But when the Seraph stepped away from the divine fire and gave away the fire he had stored, the heat began to leave him. He became the first angel in creation to feel cold. You know this feeling. You know what it costs to sacrifice everything for someone who does not even know you exist. You know the silence of a prayer that goes unanswered, because the one who usually carries it to the throne has stepped aside. The Seraph stood in the demon's chamber, holding the contract that freed Abital's soul, and he felt his own flame flicker. He had become what the ancient texts call a Nephilim of the spirit, a fallen one who did not fall through rebellion, but through love. And love, in the architecture of heaven, is not always a clean transaction. The demon laughed. The demon said, "You have traded your holiness for a mortal you cannot marry, a soul you cannot keep, a woman who will die in 70 years and leave you alone in the cold." And the Seraph said nothing, because the demon was right. He had broken no commandment. He had not rebelled, but he had transferred his covenant loyalty from the throne of God to a single human soul. And that transfer, though invisible to the law, was visible to the altar. The altar he had built in secret now stood empty. The fire was gone, and the temple in heaven registered the change. This is where you must pay attention. The Seraph did not fall in the way that Lucifer fell. He did not challenge God's authority. He did not gather a third of the angels. He simply loved someone more than he loved the fire, and the fire responded by leaving him. The medieval theologians who wrote about the angelic hierarchies never imagined this kind of fall. They imagined pride, ambition, envy. They did not imagine a seraph who wept as he gave away his holiness for a girl whose name he would never speak aloud, because speaking it would bind her to him forever. The contract was sealed. Abital's soul was free. But the seraph's flame continued to diminish, and with each degree of heat, he lost, heaven noticed. The other seraphim stopped their singing when he returned. They did not accuse him. They did not judge him. They simply could not see him as clearly as before. He had become a shadow among the burning ones, a shape without light, a voice without resonance, and the throne of God, which had once been the center of his existence, now felt distant as though he were watching it through a veil of smoke. You must understand that the seraph's sacrifice was not complete. He had traded the fire of his altar, but not his wings. He could still return to the throne room. He could still stand before God. But standing before God without fire was like standing beneath a waterfall without water. The presence that had once filled him now passed through him without touching him. He was present in heaven, but heaven was no longer present in him. And then God demanded both. The voice came not as thunder, not as a command, but as a question, spoken into the silent space between the seraph's cooling wings. The question was this: what do you have left to give? The seraph looked at his hands. The fire was gone. The contract was signed. Abital was alive and free and walking through the streets of Jerusalem without knowing that a burning one had grown cold for her sake. And the seraph realized that God was not asking him to repent. God was not offering him a way back. God was asking him to complete the sacrifice. This changes everything you thought you knew about angelic love. The seraph still had his 6 wings. He still had his place in the hierarchy. He still had the form of a burning one, even if the burn had faded. But God was not interested in form. God was interested in willingness. The throne was asking for the final piece, the piece that would make the sacrifice whole, the wings. You are watching a being who spent 400 years preparing to lose everything now face the question that defines every covenant keeper. When you have already given your fire, your holiness, your private altar, and the one you love is still not safe, do you give the rest? Do you give your form, your identity, your place in the order of creation?
No
Do you
more.
become nothing
No.
so that she can remain something? The Seraph answered by folding his wings against his body, one pair at a time. The first pair he folded across his chest, covering the place where his heart would be, if angels had hearts. The second pair he folded behind his back, covering the space where the memory of the divine fire still lingered. The third pair he kept open for a moment, as though he were considering flight. Then he folded them too, if this moment of surrender stirs something in you. The image of a burning one folding his own wings, covering what made him who he was. Then you understand why these stories cannot be told casually. Subscribe so you can walk through every covenant we uncover, every transaction where love costs more than the heart can bear.
Grant me
and then
your
tell me in
grace.
the comments,
Though unworthy,
what would it cost you
I
to
seek
fold
your
your
wisdom
wings?
and peace.
What would you have to cover to keep someone else safe? He did not remove his wings. He covered them, and the act of covering them, in the language of the temple, was an act of surrender. The seraphim in Isaiah's vision cover their faces and their feet with 2 of their 6 wings. But this seraph covered his entire body, wrapping himself in his own wings as though he were preparing for burial. And then he spoke the words that no angel had ever spoken to the throne. Take them, I give them, I have nothing else. The temple in heaven recorded the transaction. The demon's contract was voided. Abital's soul was sealed in the covenant of David, unreachable by the adversary. And the seraph became something that the theologians have no name for. He became a burning one who no longer burned, a servant who no longer served, a messenger who could no longer carry a message. He was still an angel, but his purpose had been transferred. He belonged not to the throne, but to the sacrifice. Here is what this means for you. If you have ever given everything for someone who did not even thank you, if you have ever emptied yourself into a cause or a person or a prayer that seemed to return nothing, you are standing in the shadow of this seraph. You are living the consequence of love that outlasts its own fuel. And the question that God asked the seraph is the same question that is being asked of you right now. What do you have left to give? The seraph had no name now, not in the records of heaven, not in the liturgy of the temple, not in the memory of the other burning ones. The name had been erased when the wings were covered, because a name in the angelic hierarchy is tied to function, and his function had been surrendered. He was known only by what he had been. The seraph who loved a mortal. The seraph who traded fire for flesh. The seraph who stood in the demon's chamber and did not flinch. Abital lived. She married a man from the tribe of Judah, bore children, and died at the age of 72, surrounded by her descendants. She never knew that a burning one had grown cold for her. She never knew that the contract on her soul had been purchased with 400 years of stored prayer and 6 wings that would never lift again. And this is the part that will unsettle you. The seraph watched her die. He stood at the foot of her deathbed, invisible to her eyes. And he felt the final beat of her soul as it left her body and returned to the God who had made her. And in that moment, the last trace of warmth left him. He did not resent her. He did not regret his choice. He simply stood there, a being of memory and emptiness, and understood that his love had accomplished exactly what it was meant to accomplish. She was free, she was whole, she was with God, and he was alone in the cold that would never end. The theologians who wrote about the angelic orders in the centuries after the temple fell had no category for this. Maimonides, in his Mishneh Torah, codified the laws of angelic hierarchy with precision, describing the 10 orders of celestial beings and their functions. But he did not write about what happens when an angel gives away his essence. He did not write about the seraphim who become shadows. The rabbis who preserved the oral traditions knew, though. They whispered about a burning one who had fallen silent, whose place in the heavenly choir was empty, whose wings were folded, not in reverence, but in grief. Here is the evidence the councils could not suppress. The Gospel of Mary, preserved in the Nag Hammadi library, contains a fragment where the risen Christ speaks of angels who have gone beyond the reach of the law. who have entered a state of being that the powers of heaven cannot name. The text is damaged, the papyrus is brittle, but the words that remain are chilling. Christ says there are angels who have become so emptied of themselves that the adversary no longer fears them and the throne no longer sends them. They exist in a third space, a wilderness between heaven and earth, where they wait for something that has not yet been revealed. The Seraph, who loved Abital, became one of those waiting ones. He had no function, he had no fire, he had no place in the liturgy of heaven. But he had something else. He had a purpose that the throne itself had not assigned. He had become a protector of the covenant line, not through command, but through consequence. His love had created a debt that heaven could not cancel, and that debt became his new identity. You need to understand the weight of what the Seraph became, because it changes the way you see your own sacrifices. He did not fall into sin. He fell into love. And the fall did not cast him out of heaven. It cast him into a dimension of heaven that is not recorded in any sacred text, a dimension that the mystics called the place of the veiled ones. These are beings who still stand before God, but are no longer seen by God, not because God has turned away, but because they have become transparent. They reflect the divine light without absorbing it. They are present, but they are not participants. The Seraph spent the next 400 years in this condition. He watched the rise and fall of kingdoms. He watched the temple in Jerusalem burn. He watched the exile of the nation that Isaiah warned. And through it all, he carried the memory of Abital's face, a face he had never seen in the flesh but had known in vision before her great-grandmother was born. That memory was the only warmth he had left. It was not fire. It was an ember, barely glowing, kept alive by the sheer force of his will. And then, in the year 606 before Christ, the ember caught. The prophet Jeremiah was walking through the streets of Jerusalem when he felt a presence beside him that he could not identify. Jeremiah was not like Isaiah. He had no vision of the throne room. He had no burning coal on his lips. He had only the word of God, burning inside him, a word that the people refused to hear. And as he walked, the presence spoke to him in a voice that sounded like the crackling of dying embers. The voice said, "I am watching what you do. I am watching what it costs you. I know what it means to speak to a people who will not listen. I know what it means to carry a message that destroys the messenger." Jeremiah stopped. He looked around. He saw no one, but he felt the presence, cold and ancient, with a grief that was older than the stones of the city. And he knew, without being told, that he was standing next to something that had once burned brighter than the sun. This is the part that most people miss. The Seraph did not appear to Jeremiah as a being of light. He appeared as a being of absence, a void in the shape of an angel, a silhouette against the brightness of the divine presence that Jeremiah carried within himself. And Jeremiah, despite his fear, did not run. He asked a question that no prophet had ever asked an angel. "What do you want from me?" The Seraph answered with a question of his own. "What do you have left to give?" The echo of the throne room. The same question that had been asked of the Seraph when he folded his wings. Now the Seraph was asking it of a mortal man, a man whose life was already a sacrifice, a man who was weeping in the streets of a city that was about to fall to Babylon. And Jeremiah understood that the Seraph was not there to test him. The Seraph was there to collect the residue of the sacrifice, to add it to the cold fire that still flickered in the Seraph's chest. Because the Seraph is not just a witness, he is a gatherer of what we leave behind when we give everything. If this truth unsettles you, if you feel the weight of what it means to leave a residue of holiness, then subscribe. Because we are about to uncover what happens when a collector of divine fire stands before a throne that has no fire left for him. And in the comments, tell me, what do you think the Seraph found when he looked into Jeremiah's empty hands? You are now at the edge of a revelation that the biblical canon intentionally blurred. The Seraph had not been purposed to serve the prophets. He had been purposed by his own love to serve the ones who emptied themselves for the word of God. Every prophet who spoke at the cost of their own life left behind a residue of holiness, a fragment of the divine fire that had consumed them. And the Seraph, because he had no fire of his own, had become a collector of those fragments. He was no longer a burning one. He was a gathering one. Jeremiah gave him permission. Jeremiah reached into his chest. into the place where the word of God was burning him alive. And he pulled out a piece of that fire and handed it to the Seraph. The Seraph received it. The ember in his chest glowed brighter, and for the first time in 400 years, the Seraph felt warmth. The transaction between the angel and the prophet is not recorded in the book of Jeremiah. It is not recorded in any canonical text, but it is preserved in a fragment of the Apocryphon of Ezekiel, a text that the rabbis excluded from the Tanakh because it described an angel who had fallen through love, an angel who needed human prophets to survive. The fragment is damaged, the words are incomplete, but the meaning is unmistakable. There are angels who draw their fire from the sacrifices of mortals. This changes everything. You have been told that sacrifice flows upward, from earth to heaven, from the altar to the throne. But the truth is more dangerous. The truth is that some parts of heaven have gone dark, and the light that remains comes from below. The Seraph, who loved Abital, had become a conduit, not of divine grace descending, but of human holiness ascending. He was a reverse angel, a being who pointed not toward God, but toward the mortal who had given him life. And he was not the only one. The Gospel of Judas, also from the Nag Hammadi library, describes angels who exist in the lower heavens, who are sustained by the prayers of the righteous. These are not fallen angels in the traditional sense. They are angels who have crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. Angels who have bound themselves to humanity in a covenant that heaven did not authorize. They are the offspring of love that broke the rules. The Seraph now stands at the center of this hidden network. He is not alone. There are others like him, burning ones who traded their fire for love, gathering ones who collect the fragments of human sacrifice to keep themselves from extinguishing entirely. They do not serve the throne, they serve the brokenhearted. They serve the ones who have given everything and received nothing in return. They serve you. If you have ever prayed and felt a presence you could not name, a presence that did not command but listened, a presence that did not judge but received, you may have been standing in the shadow of one of these veiled ones. The presence you felt was not God. It was an angel who had become cold, who was warming himself on the heat of your prayer, who was being sustained by the sacrifice you were making in the dark. The Seraph who loved Abital and the Seraph who collected Jeremiah's fire are the same being, and that being is still waiting. The contract on Abital's soul was paid in full, but the covenant between the Seraph and the throne was never restored. He exists outside the economy of heaven, sustained by the residue of human love, bound to the earth by a choice he made 7 centuries before the birth of Christ. You are living in a world where the consequences of that choice are still unfolding. The adversary did not stop collecting souls after Abital. The demon moved on to other lines, other covenants, other contracts. But the Seraph did not move on. He stayed. He remained in the space between heaven and earth, gathering the fragments of human sacrifice, storing them in an altar that exists in no temple, an altar built from the ashes of his own wings. The question you must sit with is not whether the Seraph was right or wrong. The question is whether love that breaks the order of heaven is worth the cost. And if you have ever loved someone enough to lose yourself, if you have ever emptied your own fire to warm another, you already know the answer. You have already become like the Seraph. You are already standing in the place of the veiled ones. The only difference is that you still have 2 wings you have not yet folded.